Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Today I have the immense pleasure of welcoming Dr. Vernon Smith, a professor of economics at Chapman University in California. He is the co-recipient of the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002 for his work that established laboratory experiment as a tool for empirical economic analysis. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
It's great to be here, Juliet.
First, I want to ask you a question that I ask everyone I interview. What is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Well, that's a lot. When I think back to when I was young, and from my perspective now, it just seems like I knew almost nothing. At the time, I really thought I was pretty smart, We all have probably a lot of self-confidence that's not entirely justified. But on the other hand, that I think gives us courage. And what's important is that when we always stay open to learning. And I think that it's important to also to realize that we learn the most when we find that our beliefs are wrong. In other words, when we are mistaken in our beliefs. And it's important, I think, to be open to that possibility, because that's when you learn the most, is when you open yourself up to examining previous beliefs, which you now find are in conflict with a lot of evidence. So
Very
that would be
interesting.
so anyway, that would be my first response to your statement.
Okay, so first I would like to talk about experimental economics. So you're the father of experimental economics. I heard in an interview where you were talking about teaching the principles of economics at Purdue University. You realized that there was nothing in your education that enabled you to understand the connection between the theory of markets, so supply and demand, and what people actually do in markets. So basically, you were teaching students how prices increase and fall based on supply and demand, how shortages are created, how prices convey information, but that you didn't know how individuals behaved and how they made their decisions, right?
Right. Yeah. We were able, you see, with using the language of supply and demand. I think we were good at describing what happens, for example, when there's a cutoff of oil, an embargo of oil to the United States. And that was one of the kind of predominant things that happened. I think, as I recall, it was in the 1970s, and then prices skyrocketed. Well, you could tell a nice supply and demand story, but what we kind of didn't understand or have knowledge of is how the perspective of people in the market and the kinds of what their experience is and how they respond to that experience in a market. And so as a result, I sort of resolved that first semester I was at Purdue in 1955 to do an experiment in the very first day of my class in January 1956.
How did you start making these experiments?
Well, I did have a model that had been used in experiments before, and that was Ed Chamberlain was a professor at Harvard, and he had a book that was quite a prominent prominently used by people in the 1930s and 40s, and it was called A Theory of Monopolistic Competition. That and a book by Joanne Robinson in the United Kingdom on imperfect competition were two books that were prominently used in microtheory classes that enable you to go sort of beyond the standard competitive model. Well, Professor Chamberlain had devised a little experiment that he used on the first day of his classes that he had in mind using it to illustrate that competition didn't really work in markets. And it was it was his way of introducing what he was going to be doing throughout the semester in his class. And indeed, his market didn't really converge to the competitive equilibrium. But what was important about his experiment is it provided a model for me to use in the information that I gave the people who are going to be in the experiments. The information I gave them either as buyers or sellers. And here's that procedure. And I'll just describe that first class that'll give you an idea how we do these experiments. I had 22 people in that class. Well, I made 11 of them buyers and 11 of them sellers. The buyers, I each gave a small yellow card, and it had their identification number on the top of the card, and on the bottom it had a price. And they understood that what that price was their value for the commodity, and that the way they would make money in the market, the way they would gain from exchange, is that they would earn the difference between that value that I gave them. For example, it might be $10, and the price they actually paid in this market when they purchased a unit from one of the sellers. For example, they might suppose a buyer had a value of 10 and made a purchase at a price of $6 from a seller in the market. Then that buyer would have earned $4. And the idea here is that all of us, when we go to market, are probably willing to pay more than we actually have to pay in the market, rather than go without it. So this notion that buyers have reservation prices, but they're looking for bargains, and of course want to buy less than this reservation price that represents the most they would be willing to pay. Well, if you take those values and they could just be random numbers, okay? They weren't in that first experiment, but just take those values, and if you sort them from highest to lowest, there's someone who has the highest, there's someone who has the second highest, and so on. Sort those from highest to lowest, and that's a demand schedule. That's what an economist means by demand. And then the same thing on the supply side, except the sellers are to think of this as like a cost, a minimum amount they were willing to accept in order to sell a good. And if you take those various supply price values of the sellers, and if you array those or sort them from lowest price to highest price, that then is a supply schedule. Well, these in that class, those schedules crossed at a specific price and quantity. Well, that's a prediction of what's going to happen in that market, you see. It's a prediction. It's a supply and demand prediction. Now, of course, I didn't really believe for a moment that these kind of naive and inexperienced and unsophisticated sophomores in my class, I didn't really believe they would find that equilibrium. But I gave them an opportunity, and the way they traded was by an open outcry, a two-sided auction. So any buyer could announce a bid to buy, stating what he was willing to pay. Some seller. Any seller could announce an asking price representing the amount that he'd be willing to sell some buyer. Well, and these bids and asks they would come in at random, and if because they're being announced from the floor, you see, from the classroom floor. So if a buyer announces a bid that a seller accepts, he shouts out, "I will take it." We now have a contract, and that buyer and seller drop out of the market because each has only a capacity to buy or sell one unit, the way I structured it. And then it goes on, and we try to get a second contract, and so on. And so I ran that process went for maybe 6 or 7 minutes, and then we stopped the auction, and then I started over. So I said, so now we've finished trading on Monday, now it's Tuesday. Okay, so that was the game. So, and I repeated it a few times. Well, this market converged pretty accurately to the equilibrium price and quantity. And I must say, I was astounded. And in fact, I didn't believe it. You see, it's interesting that we weren't, our training in economics at the time didn't prepare us for this. You'd say, well, it's good news. Well, yeah, but we were prepared for it. We didn't think this would happen.
So you were kind of surprised that even though like your students didn't really know about economics, they still kind of went back and proved this theory of supply and demand. So how did that transform you? How did that transform your beliefs?
Well, here's the thing. I thought actually there must be something wrong with the experiment, and it was only one experiment, and it did have, of course, a lot of special features. For one thing, it was completely symmetric. That is, the supply schedule was just kind of the mirror image of the demand schedule. Okay, So as a result, the equilibrium price, as well as the average value of the buyers and the average cost of the sellers, those were all the same. They were all equal. So I thought, well, that, maybe what's wrong with that experiment is there's too much symmetry. So I ran a very asymmetric case where the supply curve was very steep and the demand curve was only gently sloped. And so in the equilibrium, in that case, most of the profit earnings would be by sellers, not buyers. And so I ran that experiment. Well, it converged. It started below and it leaped up in a series of contracts, and then I repeated it over time, and it comes right up and converges to the predicted equilibrium. And so these exercises were really getting my attention because what I was observing here contradicted everything I had been taught, everything that we believed, everything that I was in turn starting to teach. Well, you just can't live with that kind of contradiction. So, so that led me to continue to do classroom experiments, and well, it changed my life.
You've created many experiments to test different economic theories and propositions and sorts of things. What have your favorite ones been?
Well, of course, that those first supply and demand experiments are dear to my heart because that those experiments opened me up into a whole new uh, means of learning. And moreover, a it was a great discipline. You could try out things. For example, my first, as I've just said, my first thought was, well, there's too much symmetry in that experiment, so I took an asymmetric case. So ideas like this you can implement and test them so that anything you think you believe, you you put that you make that belief testable. As you ask, well, now what kinds of conditions do I want to create in one of these experiments that will test the validity of that belief? And and so you work on an experimental design in that sense. And and then you proceed to test expose your belief system to this test, and it's a great discipline. In two senses, it gives you a mechanism for testing the validity of anything you think you know. It also uh, gives you practice in how you go about testing what you know. That is, how do you design an experiment? What elements do you put in it? You see, there's there's a lot to be done, a lot of work uh, to be done in devising a means whereby theories can be tested. And what was challenging about it at the time was that there was no place I could go and just read and find out how to do this in economics. Now
Because
there,
you created it.
yes, and now of course we had models of experiments coming from psychology, and one of my most memorable experiences was meeting Sidney Siegel, a psychologist. He was then at Pennsylvania State University, and he was on leave at Stanford at the Center for the Study of Behavioral Science, which is it's not part of Stanford, but it's on the property, Stanford property. It's on their campus, behind the campus. And so I was a visitor at Stanford, and that would have been it would have been the academic year 1961-62. I was on leave from Purdue, invited to come to Stanford to visit for a year. Well, among other things, I did my experiments there, so I got a chance to do them in a different university environment than at Purdue. But I also had this opportunity to meet Sidney Siegel. And it turns out he was doing economics experiments also. And I didn't know about them. He didn't know that I was doing them. And he was doing bilateral bargaining experiments, and also what we called oligopoly experiments, where you have a small number of sellers. For example, if there are two, then it's a duopoly, or three, a triopoly, but generally small numbers. And in those experiments, they simulated the demand. They didn't have real buyers the way I had in my experiments. They just simulated demand, and they had the sellers compete to announce prices, and then the prices were filled by just from whatever that demand was. So here was another person doing experiments quite independently, and we were both quite excited about that. And I learned a lot from Sidney. He not only had these working papers he was doing in economics that were not yet published, but he had some published papers in psychology, and these were all very useful to me as a young assistant professor now learning experimental methodology. And I was pretty impressed with Sidney's the rigor of his whole approach to experiment. And so I just assumed, well, he's a random sample from the psychology field, and I better look at other psychology experiments, which I did, but I tell you, none were up to Sidney Siegel's standards. What I learned was that he was kind of an outlier. And I've always been very respectful of Sidney Siegel, and I often tell experimental economists that all of these procedures that we use, which are often attributed to me, actually come from Sidney Siegel.
Would you say that he influenced your approach to science and the way you approach these experiments?
Oh, yes. In fact, the typical instructions that became common in a lot of experiments were modeled very closely after the way Sidney Siegel used instructions. And although I always cited Sidney Siegel, here's the thing. Sidney Siegel died within about 2 months after I met him. You see, so here's a guy that I met, was very much influenced by him. And his tradition was very much carried forward in my work, but he was just sort of the shadowy figure. I think from the perspective of a lot of people who I worked with and that I was interacting with. So really, and then people who know Siegel as well as my work, Siegel's work as well as mine, and many experimentalists uh, uh, do realize that I was very much influenced by him, and that the whole of experimental economics was importantly influenced by the work that Sidney did before I even knew him.
Let's talk about another one of your intellectual influences. I know that your mother was an avowed socialist, but now you're very much not a socialist. What lessons did you learn from her? Do you think if she were still alive, she might be persuaded by your work and endorse a greater role for free markets and a smaller role for government intervention?
I'd like to think so. She was a very curious and intelligent woman, widely read. She only had an eighth grade education, which was not uncommon in those days. But I must say it was a rather excellent eighth grade education. I remember in high school, in the 10th grade, my mother helping me with my English, diagram sentences. Boy, she could diagram sentences. She could do all of that with just through eighth grade. And she used her education to self-educate.
Hmm.
Uh, Studied music on her own, and was widely read. Well, she was very much attracted to the American Socialist Party, and the reason for that is fairly simple. Uh, my mother came from a family of people who worked on the railroads. They were engineers, or my grandfather was an engineer on the Missouri Pacific Railroad. His twin brother, Ezra, Asel and Ezra were their names. His twin brother, Ezra Lomax, was a engineer on the Santa Fe. They had a brother-in-law who was engineer on the Rock Island Road, the Chicago Pacific and Rock Island Railroad. So they were railroad people. Well, they had been unionized. By 1900, they were unionized because of the work of oh, now I'm sorry, names uh, uh, escape me, but
That's okay.
he was the first socialist candidate for president of the United States. Eugene Victor Debs was his
Oh, yeah.
name. Yeah, and in my family, he was known as Gene Debs. He was a he was a great hero, you see, because he had organized the railroad unions, had been involved in a strike. Uh, I think it was about 1897 or 8. And uh, the American socialist movement was very much an anti-war movement. Uh, Debs had opposed our entry into World War One, and
Mm-hmm.
knowing that he could easily be arrested, uh, he gave what you would call a generic anti-war uh, socialist speech. And this was just 2 months after the United States had entered the First World War. And he was careful not to mention that war or to even uh, uh, mention the president at that time. But nevertheless, he was arrested. He was arrested and jailed, and he was given 10 years in prison for violating the sedition, one of two sedition acts uh, that were on the books. But what's interesting about that is that and so Debs ran for president in 1920 from his jail cell. Well, my mother had just turned 21 and voted for the first time. You see, women now had the right to vote. That was the first election which women had the right to vote. And my mother had been an activist in supporting the right to vote by women, and she kind of proudly cast her vote for Debs. You see, so that's the tradition I came from, and I very much, I still very much respect that tradition because uh, they had an uncompromising kind of support for the right of dissent and for free speech and free expression. The American Socialist Party had that strong uh, tradition. Uh, Now, why they didn't see the same freedom as applying in economics is kind of a mystery. But they had a lot of confidence, you see, in the ability of democratic processes to keep the socialist intervention in the economy from going astray. And that's disastrous because I think when you go down that route, it's very hard not to make a lot of mistakes and essentially rule out the forces of independence and competition that are just as important in economics as they are in our social and political lives. And so freedom is something that I think has to be uh, supported uncompromisingly across all aspects of our lives.
Let's talk about the value of making mistakes. Last week, you wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal where you talked about the importance of learning from our mistaken beliefs. You
Yes,
write in that piece that, quote, being wrong is what teaches us all the things we didn't even know we could know. And then you
exactly.
go on to tell us that 3 times that you've been, quote, spectacularly wrong. Your words, not mine. Can you explain why it's important to make mistakes and to learn from them?
Well, I think um, I've given you one example, the first example already. Here's all these things that I believed about markets that came
Hmm.
crashing down around my ears as a result of those early experiments. And I had no idea that you could know the kinds of things that you can learn from experiments, you see. So that it's just incredible the way that opens up your vision. And then the second major experience in this line in the laboratory is if we fast forward, you see, from the late 50s, early 60s up to the 1980s, my co-author, Arlington Williams, and I have decided to design some asset trading experiments. You see, the supply and demand experiments, those are for goods that, like hamburgers, haircuts, and hotel rooms, you buy or rent them for use. You buy a hamburger to eat it,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't buy it to resell it. Haircuts, these are they consume about 70% of private product, consumer products can't be retraded. You know, it's all of the goods and services that we buy for immediate use or consumption. And and so that's the kind of market that I was studying in those days. And it was a while before I began to realize that it had these special characteristics. And the thing about assets, you not only can buy them to use them, you can buy them and resell them. And of course, the most prominent and dramatic example of that kind of a good is a home.
Yeah.
You can you buy a home to use it, okay, for shelter services, but also it has resale value. And now it's possible for the value of that good in use to become disconnected from its value in resale or in trading it. And and that's of course exactly what happened in the run-up of the housing market from about 1997 to 2008, when we had when the Great Recession broke upon us. And that recession was very much precipitated by an unrealistic run-up in the price of homes relative to their rental or use value, as well as the prices of all other goods. Every measure of a bubble were pretty strong there in the housing market. And the flow of mortgage credit, you see, into the home markets enabled resale values to get disconnected from use or rental value. And that can't continue forever. It's got to run out of steam somewhere. And that's exactly what happened. You see, actually, in this, that caught up with us in December of 2007.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a major crash there, December 2007 up into, I've forgotten, the first or second quarter of 2009, when things started to turn around. And when they did turn around, everything came back very slowly. We had a period of rather dismal growth. So here, I first started to do these experiments in the laboratory, and we were getting these bubbles, and we had structured the experiments so that people had complete knowledge of the fundamental value of these assets, the asset that they were trading, and so and it was pretty transparent what that value was, but people nevertheless, inexperienced people tended to bid up prices much higher than that fundamental value. and then they would crash. So we were getting these bubbles in the laboratory under conditions that we had not expected. See, our whole idea is let's begin this research by creating a baseline that doesn't bubble, where people will be transparent and obvious and people will trade at fundamental value. So we created that environment, but that's not the result we got. People bubbled nevertheless. And so the exercise now came around to one of understanding why we were getting these bubbles. And the first thing we did was we brought people back a second time. Still got a bubble, although not as big and not as as large a volume of trading. And then we bring them back a third time, and they're now trading much closer to fundamental value. So we
So they
established,
learn from these bubbles, right?
yeah, we established, yeah, that people could, they would, with experience, they would overcome it. But what's interesting, you see, they don't overcome this, they don't get it right by thinking about it. You see, they have to actually experience, uh, they have to have the experience that it's not a good idea to sell below fundamental value or to buy above. You're not like, that's not where the money is.
Mm-hmm.
and, but people don't get there by thinking about it. They get there by actually experiencing it. You see, they're learning from
So
their mistakes.
does the government share the same ability as individuals to kind of learn from their mistakes from, like, say with the whole like bubble thing, like people eventually just learned because they experienced it to not do that. Can the government do that?
Um, I'm very pessimistic about the prospect of the government learning that, because here's the thing: the political process is much focused on the here and now. Look at the coronavirus pandemic we have now. Everybody's focused on what a disaster it is and what's happening, and how the disease is spreading and all of the pain and the economic dislocation from that. People are not thinking ahead about how we might get out of this and how things are going to be when we start to come out of it. People are living very, very strongly in the present. Well, politicians live in the present too. And and buyers of homes like to have low down payments and low interest rates, you see. So politically, it's always a winner if you can do something for homeowners. Now, that may cause trouble down the line years later, but those politicians aren't around anymore. You see, it's a new generation that comes in. So I think it's not realistic to expect uh, politicians to be naturally attracted to the kinds of policies that give us long run stability. I think here there's a role to be, the central banks, of course, can be helpful because they presumably have a longer run point of view. On the other hand, the Federal Reserve did not anticipate the fallout that we had from this last housing bubble. They didn't forecast that. They didn't expect it even when they began to realize, uh, even before the event, that there was a housing bubble. They never saw it as something that was going to be as catastrophic as it was. Now, hopefully, that generation of economists and central banking people the boards and so forth, so on, learn from that experience and will carry it into the future. We we had similar learning in the Great Depression that, of course, didn't really last into 80 years later into the Great Recession. You know, really, really large scale recessions happen pretty infrequently, and that doesn't help memories or help policy that much when they're so widely spread. People can easily come to believe that this time it's different. And of course, maybe it is different. Sometimes things are different, but I don't think that one is going to be very different.
Hmm. Can you tell us a bit about what it's like to win a Nobel Prize? How did you find out that you won?
Well, I was in my office in Arlington, Virginia, working. I those days I usually go into my office about 6 in the morning, 6 or 6:30. I still start working pretty early, but I usually do it at home. Uh, so I was in my office. I think it was around 8:30 in the morning, Eastern time, when I got a call from a long distance call. I answered the phone, and it was the chairman of the Economics Prize Committee. Each of the various areas of the prize has a committee whose task is to come up with a nomination. They screen and come up with someone to nominate, and then they take that nomination on the morning of the announcement. They take that nomination to the Swedish Academy of Science. The Academy votes. Immediately after the vote, they come out of the meeting and have a press conference. This is why there's just almost never a leak, because the committees operate under kind of a strict code of secrecy, and then they make their presentation and the vote, whatever the vote is, they come out and then announce it. So the committee, the chairman of the committee is on the phone, and he identifies himself and said that I am, the entire committee is here. We're on a speakerphone. And he read the citation, and which is the one that's published, the one that you read, and when you introduced me. He read that, and then he asked me, "How do you feel?" I said, much relieved, because my friends have been predicting this for years, and I feel as though I let them down. So, because of course you have no control over this. I mean, your friends can want you to see you succeed, but that doesn't make it happen.
I heard
So
you say in an interview that when you won the Nobel Prize, John Blundell at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London gave you a silver bow tie with a picture of Adam Smith. Adam
yeah,
Smith was an original thinker. He was against slavery and taxation without representation. He's widely known for making a case against or for free trade. Sorry. Um, You've commented in the past on President Trump's protectionist trade policies. Do you fear that we've forgotten Adam Smith's teachings?
Oh, very much. Adam Smith would see President Trump as just a mercantilist. He, they were there were plenty of them around in 18th century England, and Adam Smith saw them as being much too influential on government policy. And you see, one of the reasons why he was became Adam Smith was identified with laissez-faire, with hands-off. The government should stay out of business, is because Adam Smith saw uh, the government as intervening on behalf of business, special interests of all sorts. The government couldn't be trusted to be neutral. And so uh, he wanted hands off because that intervention did more harm than good. Of course, a lot of modern people want government intervention because they want the government to do good. Um, but that's not Adam Smith's perspective. He didn't see good coming from policy by that route, and and indeed, of course, we've got prominent examples of one of the most prominent recent example is Venezuela, that had a very able and efficient and good economy, uh, uh, good economy, and then the government nationalized the oil companies. Uh, they attempted to impose price and wage controls. I think the main emphasis was on price controls. That created shortages, so then they seized the supermarkets and nationalized those. Well, what's interesting is that as a consequence, the whole system broke down, and Venezuela was having trouble actually feeding people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's
Governments are
rough.
not, yeah, governments are lousy at running things. You see, think about the American government. The American government doesn't build its own tanks and airplanes or do its own road repair. It hires the private sector to do that. It pays for it, but it buys it in markets. And that's an excellent model for government. Don't try to do it yourself. Look at the few things that the government has tried to do directly. Public education. Well, that's very controversial, and there's a lot of literature on the failures of the public school system. Also, the Veterans Administration. There's an example where the federal government actually run hospitals and for the veterans. Well, that got into all sorts of trouble, corruption. They now veterans have a choice to get their medical coverage. They can go to the private sector. They don't in private hospitals. They don't have to go to a veterans hospital. Well, that's the right model. You want people to be able to choose among alternatives, and better for the federal government to just pay for the medical care of the veterans and let them choose where they're going to get it. That is the model that is the best one for the government to follow.
Before we end this interview, which I've really enjoyed, do you have any parting words of advice for budding young scientists?
Yes, don't be afraid. And in fact, be bold in exposing your beliefs to evidence that might very well falsify your beliefs. Uh, we, we, we have a natural uh, confirmation bias. We like to believe that we are what we believe is true, and we tend to look for evidence that will confirm that. We don't deliberately go out and look for evidence that will falsify it. But that's when you learn the most, and that's an important discipline to get in the habit of adopting. So that would be my final statement.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure for me, and you're a great interviewer.